I'm Rebecca Goodwin. I was part of the project team. I'm the preservation officer for Otero County. And so we're here to tell you about the National Register nomination that we worked on. Thank you to the city, and the untold stories that we started out with, to kind of tell the history of some of the Japanese that are buried there. I'd like to introduce the rest of the team that I was honored to work with. I rope them into things down here all the time. Dr. Kathy Corbett. Those of you who saw the presentation when we did the first phase of the Japanese project, she's an architectural historian, but she writes National Register nominations a lot. She's a great historian. And Jane Daniels. She worked with us on the National Register nomination and really did the untold stories that you'll hear about here in a few minutes. So we'll get started and go from there. So just a little bit of background. The county, we are a county historic preservation board, a certified local government. The Otero County Commissioners established us in 2004 so that we can help other communities. We have an IGA, an intergovernment agreement, with 5 of the 6 towns in Otero County. Everybody but La Junta, they have their own board. So we can help with preservation any place in the county, all the other towns, and out in the other unincorporated areas. And so we've done a number of projects over the year to document our history. We started out kind of the Purgatory River region, southern Otero County, talking about the homesteading, the ranching. We did 2 phases of a project to document the Drive, which is the African American homestead, settlement south of Manzanola. And then we did the Japanese American project in 2019. It was funded by a certified local government grant from the state of Colorado through History Colorado, which is, if you know the old Colorado Historical Society, that's History Colorado. And through the certified local government program, as a CLG, we can get grants. We don't have to have cash match, which is a great thing for an area like ours where there's not a lot of extra money. And that has allowed us to do that, and started out writing with Kathy and Natasha Krakow and Michelle Slaughter, who are archaeologists. And they wrote in historic context, kind of the history of the Japanese in Otero County. And then we found historic sites that were associated with the Japanese and surveyed those. So we knew that there had been at least 3 Japanese schools in the county. Unfortunately, none of them are still standing. And we found a couple shards of Japanese pottery, one place. That was all that was left. And then we did some historic buildings, the Taguchi Market here in Rocky Ford, Mary's Stand, Mary Yagami's Botanicals in Swink, the Swink School, which is another community building, which was the original school, where the Japanese went to school there. As Amy and some of them, Kanishi and some of them told me, the Anglo kids were on the first floor, the Hispanics and the Japanese were in the basement. And so we documented some of those sites, and we did an inventory, because there's how many of you have been to the Rocky Ford Cemetery and gone through the Japanese section? Okay, thank you all. It is really quite spectacular, very large, and much more elaborate than what we see in a lot of other cemeteries. So we did an inventory of that, and that was with our advisors, thanks to Sandy and Sumi and Bill Takeda and Peggy Sudo on those, Donna Hirokata. That was what was really important to them, was that part of the cemetery. So out of that came this project. It's a really unusual cemetery. You're going to hear more about it, a lot of history. But we were able to do the nomination for that. And then we it's based upon, and Jane will talk about this in a minute, untold stories that tell about the lives of some of the people that are buried there. So that was the page 1. This is page 2. And so now I will let Kathy, or Jane, I don't remember. I forgot how we divided this up.
It's me.
That's you. Okay, go for it, Kathy.
Hi. Delighted to be here.
And they both came down from Denver today for this, so.
We had a nice trip. We just jabbered like little friends in the car. It was always a lot of fun.
Yeah.
So full disclosure, I was in a jazz trio with Jane's husband, who was an amazing jazz guitar player. So we have lots to talk about all the time. So anyway, there were two components to this project. I worked on the National Register of Historic Places nomination for cemetery history. And it was basically, it was to nominate the cemetery to the National Register of Historic Places. Not every cemetery would be worthy of that honor, but certainly once we started digging and really looked at it, we knew, and I found, and I learned, what Rebecca always knew was that there's some really important stuff around that cemetery and about the history of the cemetery. And the more I learned, the more I became, absolutely an evangelist of the Valley View Hilcrest Cemetery. The other component, and Jane will talk about this, is untold stories. We selected certain individuals to basically expand people's understanding of community connections and immigrate. When people immigrated to this area, is right after the turn of the last century, and it was the kinds of connections that those people made. And Jane will talk more about that. But first, I want to talk a little bit about what the National Register of Historic Places is. We tend to encounter a lot of misconceptions around it. There's this idea that that it has that somehow it's like a government hand on a property. And in this case, that's really not at all the case. The National Register is an honor. This is why I brought another pair of glasses on me. The National Register of Historic Places is the official list of the nation's historic places that have been deemed worthy of preservation. Authorized by the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966, the National Park Service National Register of Historic Places is part of a national program to coordinate and support private and public efforts to identify, evaluate, and protect America's historic and archaeological treasures. What usually happens is that members of a community, sometimes it'll be, town fathers or, a municipal government. Sometimes it can even be a federal agency like the Bureau of Land Management, things like that. But if they identify a place that's really important and has something really to say, and has something to say to future generations, then we write a nomination. And if the nomination's accepted, and it usually is, sometimes after a couple drafts, then, because it's the National Park Service that reviews it, and sometimes they're finicky, but that's okay. Anyway, it is that helps us. The National Register is simply a vehicle that helps us say our places are important. They're important to us, and they're important enough that we want to write their story and help people understand why. So this is something that future generations can carry forward. One misconception about the National and sometimes the State Register of Historic Places is that it keeps you from doing what you want with your property, and that's not at all the case in this. They do ask if you demolish a building that's on the National Register or, in some way, do something like that you write a letter so that they can take it off the list. But really, it doesn't mandate anything. You don't have to invite people. You don't have to invite tourists onto your ranch. That's not true. But the process is fun to me. This is where I get to geek out, right? The first thing we do, and Rebecca and I did this together on Memorial Day, 2023. Rebecca said, we have to do this on Memorial Day because that's when the peonies are blooming. And holy cow,
And she didn't believe me.
No, I have a grandmother called them Pineys, and she had a bunch of them, so I knew I loved them. But boy, howdy, I couldn't believe the way the cemetery was just exploding with color. It was absolutely magnificent. And so that was our first step. We take photos. We took a bunch of photos. In this case, we took 87 photos that are included in the nomination map. And they were really fun.
I think you took.
Oh, I took more than that.
Yeah, you took like 300.
No, I didn't. No, I didn't. But I did. Well, we did have an initial site visit where Jane took a bunch and I took a bunch, and then yeah. So we actually did have a lot to work with. But you know, since I do most of my writing in Denver, it was really important for me to have all of these photos that I could understand. We'll go more into that. There was another tool that also really helped a lot. But once we get back in the desk, and then also the libraries, repositories, those kinds of things, then we start researching and writing. I did a lot of research on the U-Sticks, who were very integral to the cemetery in the later years after it was established, and I used Ancestry.com a ton for that. And bless some descendant of the U-Sticks, I'm not sure exactly who it is because Ancestry isn't quite that transparent, but someone had really probably 40 photos and newspaper clippings. I think it would probably be a grandchild of the U-Sticks would be my guess. It was wonderful and it was incredibly helpful. So if any of you here know someone who's related to the U-Sticks who has a really awesome Ancestry account with a whole bunch of information, you can thank them for me, because I really, really was very, very happy that it was there and that they'd made it public so that people could understand and use, and access the information. We look at maps, the cemetery plat map of the Valley View, and then we also I looked at tons of newspaper clippings. Here's one from the Rocky Ford Enterprise from June 16th, 1905. Which is not long after the cemetery had been named the Valley View. Here is a fact not universally known in Rocky Ford. Our cemetery is not Riverview Cemetery, nor City Cemetery, nor Rocky Ford Cemetery, but Valley View. The name was officially given the cemetery when it became property of the city. Now don't forget it says. Don't forget that it is Valley View Cemetery. So this is yeah, the newspapers are rarely that in your face these days, but don't forget it. And then we also had some historic photos. The office and garage out at the cemetery in 1969. What we were able to realize is that it's been painted, yeah, and maybe there's been some of the roll-up doors replaced, but otherwise just has not changed much. Very, very good integrity, historic integrity. I shouldn't say one. Helen West. Helen West, if you're smiling down on us, I just want to say thank you from the bottom of my heart. Helen West was a local historian. Does anyone not know who Helen West was? So you all do. Okay, so I'm preaching to the choir, really, is what this is. But 15 volumes of compiled notes from the Rocky Ford newspapers over time, literally 15 volumes of notes by topic. So there's volume 5 is devoted to the library and the cemetery. It was an amazing chronology. So this was absolutely, this is a historian who absolutely recognized the importance of the place that she lived and the importance of all of this going forward. It includes not just notes, but clippings, and some photocopied photographs. So I took them.
All the city council
minutes. Yeah, I took them and I actually made them searchable by keyword. They're on my laptop. If anyone would like searchable ones, I would be happy to share that. Just make sure I've got your information, and I'll probably just go ahead and put them up on Google Drive, and we can do it that way if you wanted to do that. But I would be happy to do that because I was able to put in USTIC and come up with everything when I wanted to do it. It saved a lot of time, but it was really, so this was a magnificent tool, and something that I don't know that I've ever encountered in a community like this exactly. The local historians have their own very special, and docents have their very special place in heaven. But this was like really a whole nother level. And then another thing we do then, we also generate maps. So this is when we write the story of the place, and then we generate maps. And so we create a topo map, which is required, and we also have a site map. So this is a site map that I made. It's kind of hard to read, but it shows the boundary. So so this quarter section of is owned by the town, is owned by is designated for the cemetery, but because only these quarter sections are historic, we drew the boundary for the National Register part just around that. This area here has burials after 1998. They're not considered historic. At some point, 30, 50 years from now, somebody might want to write an amendment to this to include other burials, as those things might become important. I will probably not remember anyone's name by then, so. We mark this, we make sure that we know where the roads are, and then here's the flagpole platform, the pump house, the sexton's house, the garage, the entrance gate, the original north entrance gate. What was called Potter's Field is now called Peak View, part of the cemetery. And then we marked the additions, and then I also numbered the plots, or the blocks. The blocks, as we go through. So we try to get as much detail in there as possible, just so people know where they are and can navigate it. And then we take all these photos. This is just a sample. Put them up two on a page, and then we document just vistas. We document the fence. Here's also the stone wall. Here's also the stone wall with the 1916 inscription on the concrete. The sexton's house, the garage. Occasionally, certain headstones. This one in kanji, Japanese. It's on the other side of the pump house, not with. It's with one other grave right there. It's a 2-year-old who passed away. In I think 1918. So, and that was, 1918. Does anyone remember what happened in 1918? Yep, Spanish influenza. So you can pretty much bet that might be exactly what took that poor little kid out. So, I also, by way of documenting these photos in a nomination, make a photo map. I have a table that will tell me that says what direction I'm facing. That's one of the National Park Service's requirements around all this. They need to know what direction you're facing when you take a photo. But I also just plot where I was standing when I took each photo. Because it was impossible to kind of get it all on one page, I made 3 different maps with a key map there. So if you do read the nomination, you'll be able to interpret that and go, oh, okay, well, let's see. Photo 31 is, yep, they were standing right there, so we know what we're looking in that area. This really helps people navigate. One of the things that was incredibly helpful was the orthomosaic map. And for this, major shout out to Otero County and Lex Nichols, because holy cow, the resolution on these things is just unbelievable. The resolution, unfortunately, on this screen with this PowerPoint projector is far less, but you can see this area here is here. So we have this aerial of the entire thing. All I had to do was zoom in, and we have rows of headstones. We have the tops of the trees. We even had, and then zooming in a little more here, the flagpole platform. And as you go in, you don't lose resolution hardly at all. At least not on, the primitive machines that I use. So, but it was absolutely amazing and extraordinarily helpful as I was trying to navigate this. So once it was written, once we produced this nomination, and then we had to navigate the road to National Park Service approval. We produced, a total of 3 draft nominations from January of this year into April of this year. The first one was for the National Register historians to just make comments on. They got it back. We addressed their comments, made it a little better, a little tighter, sent it back, and that was one for CLG review, which was Certified Local Government Review, and that came to Otero County, and then they.
And I told them I wouldn't help them review it because I helped write it.
Because you helped write it with what do you call that, a conflict of interest?
Yeah,
I think so. And then we wrote one for the review, and then we fixed it and tweaked it and made it even better, and sent it to the State and National Register Review Board, which meets 3 times a year in Denver, but it's historians, archaeologists, and community members from really all over the state. And they convene either virtually or in person in Denver at History Colorado and review them. And we were very fortunate. Rebecca and I very nervously sat in our little chairs and answered all their questions. And on May 17th, it was approved.
Unanimously.
Yep. It was unanimous.
It was unanimous.
Unanimous. So yes, I was.
That's always a good feeling.
Yes. Nobody was like, "What is this thing?" No, nobody did that. It was great. It was very encouraging. We got some good suggestions that we incorporated before we did a final version that went on to the National Park Service.
They're being very modest, apparently. It was one of the most beautiful nominations that they had seen.
Someone really complimented us. They said,
It was a high quality nomination.
It was, that was very flattering. You know what it was? It was those peonies. You just have to, like, those peonies. You just have to be like, I'm gonna write the heck out of this. So it was great. But on July 29th, 2024, it was signed onto the National Register of Historic Places by the National Park Service, by the reviewer of the National Park Service.
Was it too bad I was on one day sooner?
Anyway, so I'll tell you a little bit about what we learned about. So that's the process. That is the process of writing a National Register nomination, and kind of why we felt it was why we felt it was important. But thinking about, I'm going to read a little bit of this. Well, this is from what's called the Statement of Significance that Rebecca and I wrote for the cemetery, and why cemeteries are important, and why they're not scary. I know we're coming into Halloween. I mean, come on, we are. It is. There's decorations are going up now, but they are actually places of connection and places of memory, and places where we remember love. So we wrote, cemeteries are many things to the people who visit them. They're places of memory and the names of loved ones carved into stone that evoke them in the hearts of those who held them close. They are tributes to the departed through the flowers and shade trees that delight and shelter visitors. Cemeteries are repositories of local history, the resting places of people who long ago made such an imprint on a town, region, or culture that generations hence, people stop to see their graves and remember them. Walking the rows of headstones, reading names and birth and death dates, visitors wonder about the lives of the ones who lie beneath their feet and what they might have left behind. Did this man born in 1896 carve wooden toys for his grandchildren? Did the woman who died in 1965 make the best green chili in the county? What about the girl who died so young in 1942? What dreams did she never get to realize? In cemeteries, we can see the connections within the communities and the historical events that profoundly affected them, literally written in stone. A block of graves with headstones written partially in kanji demonstrate the ties between the members of the Japanese American community. Another block with a line of grave markers put in place in 1957 attests to a tragic accident that claimed a dozen members of the area's Latino community as they were traveling to work in the melon fields. Military grave markers represent those who gave their due, if not their lives, for their country and all they believed it stands for. The Valley View Hilcrest Cemetery in Rocky Ford, Colorado is a focal point for the people of Rocky Ford and the surrounding towns who take immense pride in the peonies that burst with color among the headstones every spring and who show up to remember and honor those they miss. It reflects and is an important element of the history of Otero County and the region, and it merits placement on the National Register of Historic Places. So, what was significant? Well, this, as an architectural and landscape historian, this made me really happy. Count of two cemetery types in one place. This is really unusual. If you look at a map of a cemetery or go on to Google Earth and look at cemeteries, you really rarely see a pattern of development this stark. So what we have are Valley View and Hilcrest, and they look very, very different. They were designed to be very, very different. Valley View is a good example of the town-city cemetery, and Hilcrest is a good example of what has been called the Lawn Park Cemetery. And these are designations that that scholars have given cemeteries as they have studied the history of cemeteries. The Valley View Cemetery was first moved to the site in 1887. It was really, at that point, it was more official than the cemetery that came before, which was really what was called, more often called a burial ground. And it was where the white school was originally. And when they moved it over in 1887, I think they started kind of up in this area, and then it sort of grew from there. By 1908, they needed like a real map, and so that was when they actually did a plat of the cemetery called a plat map, which is just a drawing of all the blocks with the numbers of each one. In 1916, running out of space, they purchased the land to the south. This was all of this quarter section originally belonged to a farmer named J.C. Fox. So they purchased the first edition in 1916 and platted that, and not too long after platted the second edition all the way to the south in 1919. And so it was, and these town cemetery type cemeteries that were very common in the early 19th and 20th century. They were usually owned by the towns that they lived in, and they were usually near the edges of the town. They're sometimes confused with the rural cemeteries, but a rural cemetery was actually something else. The rural cemeteries started in 1830 in the East, and there are really very few examples of those out here in the West. But looking at the grid design, can you see that all right? Yeah. So this is the 1908 plat map of the Valley View Cemetery. So it numbers all of the grids, and then as you get over here into the Potter's Field, things are a little more densely packed. One news article I found said that there was an undertaker who got in trouble for burying people only 2 feet deep in the Potter's Field. So yes, well, but I don't. And apparently, sometimes people would, you probably see something eroding out. But there was some dissent around that. But one of the things that we thought about was this grid design. And why was it? This was this town city cemetery at a time when many other cemeteries, especially in the east, were being, had undulating pathways and water features, and were a lot more about trying to imitate wild nature. This grid design, this very regimented grid design in the Valley View, kind of came around at a time when people were really thinking about settlement and town building in the West. And that's when they started thinking about the grid. So, as Rocky Ford had these intersecting blocks that were uniform, maybe not entirely on a north-south cardinal grid, but following the railroad really more, they also did the grid because that made sense to them. And those grids all started with the public land survey system, the township and range system. And that came out of a survey, Thomas Jefferson came up with this idea of the township and range. So everyone would get their equal measure. So it was about equality. It was about this idea that everybody could have the same amount. We saw features about beautification features. So as the cemetery developed, the stone wall was built in 1916, and it's right there it's on County Road E, like right on the very. If you haven't seen that inscription, it's right on the very northeast corner of the cemetery. You can go see it on top of the wall. Mrs. Lewis Swink in 1901 was disturbed by the idea that there were no tree-lined avenues in the cemetery. It really was just ground. She donated 500 ash trees, 500, that were planted along the main avenue and along the edges of the cemetery at that point. This is an ash tree that's over on it's on the west side of the Valley View. It's a beautiful tree. It's a beautiful ash tree, but I don't think it's original. I don't know. Do they know if there's any of those that would still be there? By 1922, 1923, the Eustics were active, and they platted the Hilcrest Cemetery, and they did a very different idea. Basically, they took a circle and did 3 overlapping ovals within that circle. It was a very different thing. It was the roads were curving. It gave people a chance to appreciate the cemetery and the stones and the landscape from different angles, as opposed to just the long rows. They still had the headstones in rows, but because the roads curved, you could see them in different ways. And so this was really pretty interesting. The Eustics had come to Rocky Ford in 1913 from Victor, Colorado. They had married in Bangor, Michigan, and moved out to Colorado. They actually did go through Rocky Ford on their honeymoon, and they really liked it. But they ended up in Victor, where he was a mining engineer. But there was a terrible disaster. There were a bunch of miners who were killed when an explosion basically destroyed the elevator they were coming up a shaft on. And the undertaker was so overwhelmed that he stepped in to help and started learning undertaking. And so he became interested in it, and by 1913, they had three little girls then, and they decided to come to Rocky Ford. He bought T.F. Dobbs' undertaking business. T.F. Dobbs was an undertaker his business was in the second story of a commercial building. I think it was on Commercial, and there was an undertaker. It might have been the undertaker that was. It's in there. I can't remember it right now. Undertakers were often associated with hardware stores back then. That's okay. But it made sense because that was where you could get the material to build a coffin. So it was. I think Dobbs might have been the hardware store undertaker, but he bought Dobbs out, established Ustick and Company, and then a few years later, in 1916, they had a little baby boy by then, Carl Jr., who would go on to take over the Ustick's undertaking business when he was an adult. They bought 305 North 8th Street in 1916, which is still the funeral home in town. Now, Carl and Millicent were both licensed undertakers. She was absolutely active in that business and a full partner. So I think this is something that people often overlook. But if they think, no, well, back in those days, women didn't really do that. No, women did. And she was a full partner. He was the president and she was the secretary of the Hilcrest Cemetery Association. And together they platted the Hilcrest Cemetery. They owned it until 1961, when they sold it to the town of Rocky Ford. And it didn't all happen at once, but you can see here, here's the perfect circle that it sits within. And over time, 1936, it only went to here, about to here. And by 1947, it was growing in, it was, and then it wasn't until the 50s that they had actually put in all the roads. So as the cemetery filled, they fleshed it out more, So it was really kind of, the cemetery was the project that grew over the course of their professional lives as undertakers. And this is what we consider a part of the type, it's the lawn park type. So it kind of, lawn park cemeteries were, usually we see them in the early 20th century, they kind of shift away from the Victorian ideas around death. There's more emphasis on beauty in the landscape. And with the overlapping ovals, we talked about that, allows the visitors to appreciate it from many angles. The Usticks were also the ones that were the proponents of peonies. And at one point, I don't know if this is still true, we didn't find out, but at one point, peonies were the only flower that you could plant in the cemetery. Now there are stands of iris, and there are big rose bushes that are still there. They may predate that particular rule, which I think was, oh golly, it was like the 1770s. Yeah, and but it was the peonies. The peonies were the Ustick's idea. Another thing we really thought a lot about were the ties for ethnic communities. So this is one of the National Park Service, one of the things that they emphasize is are places that are significant for ethnic heritage. And so we thought about the Latino community, and looking, this is just, and Rebecca will talk about this, notable people in the cemetery, but looking here, this stone here is, it was Sergeant John Ben Valdez, who was a young man who died in Vietnam, and he was only 22, but he was awarded the Silver Star Medal posthumously for gallantry in action. He was killed in Quang Nam on August 1969. Yeah. And he was actually carrying another soldier, wounded soldier, to safety. when he died. Also, in block 31, are a long rows of markers for the 12 people who died when a train hit a truck of workers as they were traveling to work in the fields, in the beet fields. It was June 11th. It was at that time the worst motor vehicle accident in Colorado history. There were a few people who survived it, but really basically most of them were sitting in the back of the truck, some were in a cab, and they turned onto the section road from what's Highway 50, and there were boxcars parked along the train tracks right there. So the driver didn't see the train coming, and the train didn't see the driver, because the boxcars were parked so close to the road. There just wasn't any way to do that. It was extremely tragic, and it was. The cemetery also strongly reflects Japanese and Japanese American community ties. Block 21 is probably the greatest concentration of headstones that are also written in kanji, and Rebecca will talk about this. One of the things that we see here, though, and this is interesting, there is a reason that Block 21 has this concentration. And it's because the JCL in the 1950s decided that it would be really a good thing for Japanese Americans in the community to have their graves in one place. So people in the community could go and decorate them and visit them together and have, and help that to be a real community builder. And so the JCL actually bought most of the plots in Block 21 that in order to reserve them for members of the Japanese American community. And then in 1979, they had, this is Block 21, so you can see there were not many trees even then there. I don't know if that was, I think it's further south than the trees that the swing had planted back in 1901. But on April 15th, they had a tree planting ceremony with members of the Issei, who were first, or Issei is the first generation, meaning people who immigrated from Japan to the U.S. to honor them. And with that, I'm going to hand it over. Hi. Did I go way too long?
You're fine. Everybody knows I can talk fast. So, but this is really, so we were talking about, it was very important, the cemetery and the concentration of Japanese that were buried there was very important. But many of the headstones have kanji, Japanese writing on them. And we don't really know who was buried there. We don't really know all the details. Some of them don't have any English at all. So we were very fortunate through the University of Denver. We came in contact with Jonathan Pumas, who was, when we started, he was working on his PhD from Harvard, but he specializes in Asian languages and cultures. And so we took photographs, we had a little bit of money in the grant for translation. We took photographs of some of the headstones and started sending them to him for him to translate from the photographs, which was kind of interesting, especially since some of the headstones are starting to be worn a little bit. So we were able to take that. And then he is so efficient and so good, and he was so excited about the project. He sent it back and said, oh, we have money left. So we went back and took more photographs and sent those to him. By then he was in Japan writing his dissertation. So they went to Japan and he translated and came back. What was really interesting, back here on the table is a book that has all the pages of the translations in it. But they'll tell you who was there, but maybe this one, which I always thought was a beautiful headstone. This is a specific temple in Japan. That was where he was from, the prefecture where he was from, and the village. And then they may say, we'll talk about what line he is within Japanese, his family, when he died, using the Tasho, the year, which was 1918. He died and he was 42 years old. Some of the other translations may say that they are part of a family, and they may give somewhat of their hierarchy within the Japanese culture. Some of them have other things, but they're really interesting, and we could not have done that without those translations. So we now have those. We will compile those with the inventory we did the first time. The city will have those, and so if people want to find somebody who may be buried in Rocky Ford, this will help them be able to find them. One of the things I found as we were working through another part of this was there's a wonderful online database. It's called Find a Grave, and they're on cemeteries all over the country. Valley View and Hilcrest are both on Find a Grave. They're listed separately. But and quite often people are on Find a Grave because a family member submits it, or they're looking for somebody, or a community does. Virtually none of the Japanese are on Find a Grave. There's only a couple. Many of the older Hispanics also are not. Early burials of the Hispanics were never entered. So this gives us an opportunity to take this information, get it to Find a Grave, and so that people that are looking for their family members can actually find them and know that they're buried here in Rocky Ford and where they are. So this is a really incredible tool. And one thing, I serve on the National Board of Preservation Commissions, and I have a colleague in Seattle. He's with the King County Preservation. They have paid staff out there. They have a lot of people. But he's been working with the Japanese cemetery there that they're documenting. The headstones are very, very simple. Walk up through this area. There are beautiful headstones, very elaborate, very unique, not all the same, and a lot more engraving on them, a lot more kanji, a lot more detail. And that was, when I sent him some of the photographs, Todd said, this is amazing. We have nothing like that in Seattle, in that area. So I think that's another thing that makes this really remarkable is many of the Japanese that came here, they worked incredibly hard. The first 20 Japanese, we think there were a few Japanese here before that, but in 1902, the year after the sugar factory, the year they opened, they realized they didn't have enough farm workers. They contracted with a man by the name of Pocasano to bring in 20 Japanese men to farm for the sugar factory. They also brought in a number of farm workers from Sonora, Mexico, and 162 Navajo to work for the sugar factory. So that, as we dug into this, the cemetery really tells the story of Rocky Ford and the growth and the decline of the sugar factory. But it really does tie those things together. So we did the translations. And I'm saying one of the challenges to documenting history. So I actually was in Southern California where it's a little bit warmer in the winter and working on this, and Kathy would call me and said, I need you to write the history of Rocky Ford. Okay. But thank you, Helen West.
I did it really fast, and it was really good.
Yeah.
I'm just saying.
And I love Helen West because there was so much information there to go through. The founding of town, there's other documents and other books. So we went to things like that. There's some books that have been written. Francis Keck wrote a book. Mr. Dahl wrote a book many years ago about Rocky Ford. And so you start looking at all those different things and combining them and saying, do these things match up, doing that. But one of the things that is a challenge, and I'm being a historian, and I cringe every time, we have a tendency to think that everything's going to be digitized now and we don't have to keep any of the paper documents. And we see that all the time, and I cringe, and that's horrible. I remember seeing many years ago Helen West compilation. It was in the library. I know Sheila probably remembers it. It was printed out. It was on the shelf. I hadn't seen it in years. Went in there and I said, I'm looking for this history, and I said, oh, we have a couple CDs back here that I don't know if this is what you're looking for. And they were on CDs. They had a set of CDs, 2 CDs with all that information on it. And they weren't quite sure, it had kind of been forgotten what it was. So, and I'd gone up there with, a piece of paper and everything. And I said, okay, will you hold on to these? If I go home and get my computer, get the flash drives, can I come back and make copies of all this? So they're on my hard drive. They're in about 20 different flash drives. I've sent them to every place so we don't lose that. But we can't recreate what Helen West did. It's newspaper articles, it's old minutes, it's things like that. The other part is we tend to think that history is those things that we know. There's parts of our history are well documented, but there's parts of our history that aren't. If it weren't for people like Sandy and Sumi and Bill Takeda and those that helped us, Donna Harikata, different people that gave us information, we could start filling in the Japanese history. And then we can double check it, we could cross check it, we could find information, we have a place to start. We can go to Ancestry. Same, the Latino history, Hispanic history is even harder. We haven't researched the history of the Hispanics and Latinos in this county. It's not been done. They are very hesitant, they are very marginalized, I don't blame them. And if you think about it, we're sitting in what was Mexico. This was all Mexico. And so that's not been there. So to start trying to pull some of that information together, I started calling classmates of mine from class of 1977 at Rocky Ford High School and saying, can you help me? Because we wanted to start finding out who some of the people that were significant, who's buried there, not just the names we always hear, but all those that are there. So I would say, please keep those documents, keep those information, keep the archives. We can digitize it, but if it's not kept up current, then it becomes inaccessible. There's a wonderful thing called Colorado Historic Newspapers. And they have a lot of them, you know, Rocky Tempest had a newspaper. I found a lot of stuff on Tempest there. It was only for a few years, and you have to sit there and you can't really search it, but they're wonderful. But there's a lot of documents, but the best things come from the local communities and from the families. So one of the things we did, we wrote the history of Rocky Ford, and then because the cemetery is eligible because of its association with the Japanese history and the Latino Hispanic history, we had to write those histories. And again, Helen West was amazing, and Kathy, I started saying, I found this, but I don't find this, and she was on Ancestry, and Jane was looking up things. But then a lot of cemeteries in a National Register nomination, they'll list a few of the people that are buried there. Cemeteries usually are not listed because of the people that are buried there. Abraham Lincoln, you know, there's a few. Old North Cemetery in Boston where I lived, but for most part they're not. But there are a lot of notables. We use the term notables. They're worthy of attention, they're remarkable. There are so many people that have given so much to this community that are representative of this area. So we listed some of those, and then that was the other part was, okay, who were the notable people? Well, I started going back through Helen West's early things, and there was early newspapers, and they talked about this businessman and that businessman and the names. Well, a lot of them, they were here and they left, they're not buried here. We all know the Swinks. There are certain families we know, the Goodwins, the Swinks, the Bishes, that were here for many years. But there's so many more, so who was notable? Who was notable to the Japanese communities? And I started asking who's notable to the Hispanic community, who mattered to you? Who really made it important? And started getting those, well then it's like, well, are they buried here? Find a grave, you know, or check and see, are they buried here? And then can we find enough information to really say what their contributions were? And so that was to put those in there, and I think that was one of the comments. The Park Service says, told the National Register historian and Denver's like, you know, these nominations don't have to be quite this detailed. And I will say I pushed, I was kind of OCD about it, which I tend to be. This is our local history. This is not for the Park Service. This is not for the National Listing. This is for us, for the people that have lived here, is just to start getting a concept of some of the people that built this community, that kept it going. And they're not all the names you think about. Otero County had a superintendent of all schools. First one was a woman. She's buried here, Mary Jane Anderson. She was elected as superintendent in 1897. That is really remarkable. Some of you remember Eddie Clute, Francis Clute. Do you know how many patents Francis had? He has over 300 patents. He started EDCO manufacturing with his son. He invented the first patent for the foldable stadium seats. Francis did that. He's buried here. Reverend Patrick Conway, that was someone that a lot of the Hispanics, Darren Garcia was wonderful, got a lot of information. He came here as a priest. He was here for many years. It's unusual for a Catholic priest being buried where their parish was, but he was for so long, he's buried here. He built up the Catholic Church, tripled it in size, and then when the small Catholic Church needed more room, came up with the idea the air base in La Junta was closing. The Catholic Church here is the chapel from the air base in La Junta. So he did a lot. Jacobo Duran, he served in World War I and World War II. He was a U.S. representative to Mexico and Costa Rica, and he was a charter member of the Colorado Civil Rights Commission. He's buried here. And then Tats Heracata Farms. He was the first one to come here, started farming in 1915. They're one of our very few Centennial Farm Ranch families left in Otero County. And then there are those that gave other contributions. It's not just, it's business leaders, it might be political, it might be religious. Joe and Mary Tilley, I remember them. They gave many, many years. They were foster parents, they were Boy Scout leaders. They ran softball coaches. She was the founder of the Rocky Ford Wrestlers Mothers Club, which I remember because the year I was 1 year when I was in high school, we had all 12 state champions. That's a big thing. That's a part of Rocky Ford's history. Dr. Robert Martin Pollock. You know where Play Park Hill, that idea came from? Dr. Pollock, he was a doctor. He came here, he worked as a pharmacist. He started work, he got his doctor's license in 1894. Came here, worked as a pharmacist, worked as a doctor. He was there for 3 terms. He went to an engineer in Pueblo and had him lay that out, Play Park Hill. Lay out the roads and all that. It didn't all get built right away, but Play Park Hill is because of Dr. Pollock. Ryan's Pond, how many of you that grew up here have been at Ryan's Pond? They were 2 brothers, they were doctors. No, they weren't doctors, I'm sorry. They had a seed company that they established Ryan's Pond. And then like Ben Valdez, like Kathy mentioned, who grew up in an adobe house in Grand Valley, joined the Marines and gave his life in 1969 in Vietnam. So those are just a sample. There's a long list in there. There'd be more if I could have found enough information, we had more time. But I think that's also something that we can continue to do in the future. And then the second component of this project was the Untold Stories, which Jane's going to talk about and introduce, but we could not have done it without, we had a group of advisors, and 2 of them are here tonight. We're very honored, Sumi and Sandy. We could not have done this project or done this without all of you. Peggy Suda, Bill Takeda, and they really kind of helped us define this and decide where we go with the Untold Stories. And now we're going to turn it over to Jane. Oh, you want to know who you are?
All right. Good evening. Jane Daniels. I want to thank you for having me, and I'll try to get through these without crying because I have this like soul, I think, that connects to other souls sometimes. So I actually feel quite honored to be part of this project. As Rebecca said, I was in charge of the Untold Stories. Not really in charge, but I was sort of tasked, let's say, of putting the stories together of 5 particular people whom hopefully I will do justice to tell their life story. It's quite hard actually to encompass somebody's full life, right? And in a small amount of pages. But if you're all interested, all the details of the Untold Stories are written here, and we'll have them up eventually on the website.
Yes.
So you can read the full story in all detail. But so what I'll do here is try to do it in sort of the short form. But the Untold Stories part of this project really was modeled after Fort Logan Cemetery. They did a phenomenal job of telling untold stories about different those buried there. called Untold Stories More Than a Headstone. So that's sort of how this came about. Dear Rebecca did a lot of the contextual studies. She, the very first slide, did interviews and oral histories with first-hand sources, newspaper article, military records, photographs. We really could not have done this without our advisors, who've already been mentioned and thanked, because they're the ones that let us in, so to speak, and provided us with the information that allowed us to tell these stories in full. Our advisors also helped provide themes, which then kind of narrowed down how we interpreted and translated these stories to the now. And these themes turned out to be land and opportunity, patriotism and legacy and honor, adversity and loss and resilience, or life as Americans was a theme that really came out, acceptance, which was a really interesting one, and then gaman, which is a Japanese term that translates to perseverance, although I've been told it doesn't really quite have a direct translation in English. And it's interesting too, because if any of you know, I also work with Amache, the Granada Relocation Center out east here, and working with that community as well. That term comes up a lot, so I think that's very embedded in the culture of Japanese and their history and how they present themselves in their world and community. So again, thank you to our advisors. I know we have Sandy here too, so thank you. Again, this was our lunch where we sat and we talked to you about these stories. Now, how do I move forward there? Okay. Okay, so the first theme was land and opportunity, and Sadakichi Harada, whom I'm sure you all know the name because of Harada Farms, is our first subject here. He was born February 12, 1889, passed September 4, 1962. You can visit his headstone in Block 21, as a lot of the Japanese Americans are buried there, as you all know. So he came from he was in Issei, so a Japanese that came directly here to the United States from Tanabe, which is in the Wakayama prefecture. And basically his name, he lived up to his name. Sadakichi actually means large field in Japanese. In Japan at that time, there wasn't, they owned a farm, but in that land at the time was quite impoverished. And so Sadakichi decided at age 17 that he would leave for the United States to seek land and opportunity. In 1907, he took a steamship voyage across the seas, 28 hours, quite turbulent, as our understanding, and landed in San Francisco. And at that time in California, there were quite a few Japanese already farming. It was quite, there was a lot of activity, a lot of success already, and so Sadakichi decided to head east. He had heard and gotten word that there was a lot of sugar beet farming and opportunity here in the Arkansas River Valley, and had a ticket to Los Animas through the train, and ended up coming here and worked the farms of the, I'm sorry, I gotta keep moving because there's so many details, to the American Sugar Beet Company. Well, as he worked here, his supervisor acknowledged what a good work ethic he had and said, hey, we're gonna lease, you should lease some farmland. So he ended up leasing 60 acres, farmed it so well that he ended up having a cantaloupe shipping and a warehouse that he developed, and then eventually became the Harada Farms. And then he turned that brand into the Sunset brand. And please, if there are any details that I'm missing that are important that I need to tell, just tell me, with onions and all kinds and vegetables. It became very well known and also sort of a unique farmer in that here. Later he married Tammy Takeda, and they raised 9 children, and they all farmed and helped him on the farm to develop a business. Okay, and then in the end, just to kind of round out his story, he was a very prominent leader in the Japanese American community. He was a Buddhist, and then in World War II, of course, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, a lot of Japanese Americans fled the West Coast, and many of them ended up here, and Sadakichi was well known to help those people that were displaced by providing them loans and other advice about how to start business and especially farming here. So that is Sadakichi Harada. And again, I just want to say, it's quite an honor to actually like kind of really get deep into these stories, and there's so much to people's lives. So if I have missed something that is important, please let me know. Or again, they're in the written document. Okay, Colonel Suiko Kumagai, January 23rd, 1920, passed May 9, 2017. So more of our younger untold story. She actually was born here in McClave, Colorado. Her parents were Issei, but that made her an Issei, so second generation. She was the youngest of 6 children who moved, and her parents then later, they came here on the working for the railroad in the early 1900s, and later moved in with her sister to Cheyenne, Wyoming. And
No.
then, no?
No.
No? And then to Denver? No? Oh.
I'm sorry. Suiko, both of her parents had died by the time she was 4 years old, and so she was lived with a family down near McClave until her older sister Toki married a Hericata. Then she came to Rocky Ford and grew up living there. She left and went to the West Coast and worked in a canning factory and found out she wasn't very fast. Came back and she worked ended up in Wyoming as a nanny, working for a family. And then followed them to Denver.
That's right.
Yeah, and then she followed them to Denver, and a neighbor encouraged her that there was an opportunity for her, she'd make a really good nurse. So that's.
Ah, okay. So she did not move in with her sister to
No,
Cheyenne?
no.
Okay, then I had that wrong.
No.
My apologies. Okay, so when she was in Denver with her family.
No, she was in Denver with the family, she was taking care of their children.
Ah, the family was that right? It wasn't, okay, gotcha.
And you have that right in the story.
You got it right in the story.
You have it right in
Then
the
what
story.
did I do wrong here? I'm sorry. I told you I would mess up, okay?
Yeah, you're looking at notes, aren't you?
Yeah.
Well, okay, so thank you. Thank you. So in 1941, she, in Denver then, one of the neighbors, I think, encouraged her to become a nurse. And she subsequently went to nursing school. And in order to qualify there, she had to take a course in chemistry. And she ended up taking that at the Emily Griffith School in Denver. And actually, after she got admitted, one of the directors said, well, I guess I'll have to admit you. That was kind of an interesting thing. And then during the war, sort of a connection to Amache, her sister, and her children at the time were interned at the Granada Relocation Center. So it's kind of an interesting thing. And to my understanding, she even went to go visit her sister and family there.
And some of the
as well.
Hericatas, yeah, because it was an aunt that had moved to California, came back, it was at Amache. Quite prestigious in terms of her accomplishments, in terms of her nursing career during the war, and she also, after she finished, I was kind of lost on this part. Following the bombing of Pearl Harbor, she was interrogated, and actually she and her other fellow students who were Japanese American were not allowed to wear their uniform. But eventually during the war, she volunteered and served in the Army Nurse Corps and became a volunteer in Hiroshima and cared for the atomic bomb victims there. And also because of her fluency in Japanese, was able to train the Japanese nurses there and also how to care for those that were burn victims. She then later also served in the Korean and Vietnam War, and then again helped victims in Saigon, and I think did training in 20 of the field hospitals. She oversaw 20 field hospitals in Vietnam.
Very accomplished. Her career then ended with Fitzsimmons Army Hospital, and she was then given the title of Colonel, and eventually was the recipient of the Bronze Star, the Meritorious Service Medal, and the Army Commendation Medal. There is some articles written about her, including this one here featured in the Nisei Cadet Nurse, where her title of the story is actually how she married Uncle Sam, because she was asked, why did you not marry? And she said, well, because I married Uncle Sam, and that ended up being the title of this article that is featured here. Now there's so much more to this story too that, again, really impressive. The third of our untold stories is Adversity and Loss and Resilience, and this is represented by Henry, or Hank, I believe is known here, Konishi. Born November 24, 1919, and passed one. Henry was born to Issei parents and then grew up in Imperial Valley, California. His parents were very successful farmers in the Imperial Valley, and he, as a result, in his early years, also became very successful in farming. And in fact, at age 17, he was on the board himself of what they called the Nyland Farmers Association, which I think was a pretty big deal for them back then. However, his father passed away in 1942, just a few days before the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and that was quite unfortunate because what ended up happening is they came to his home apparently and asked him, "Where's your father? Where's your father?" Well, he passed away, and they didn't believe him. They thought that he had fled because of the Executive Order 1966, which ordered the Japanese Americans to go to the internment camps. So under military escort, the Quinishis packed all the very few belongings that they had, and they fit it into a pickup truck and car, and they hastily left California. At that time, they had known somebody, I believe, in the seed company who was in Oklahoma, who invited them out here, and then later they came to Otero County. On their way, they did encounter, unpleasantries, of course, like during the war, no Japs allowed signs. These are those common stories that we know. And so at that time, you can only imagine sort of early adult now without a father. World War II starts, he's having to move to a new place with his mother and sister and start a whole new life. So, there's a lot there. And so eventually came to Otero County, was offered a job in Swing, where he drove horses and tractors on the tomato and onion fields, and he supervised the picking crews then. Later he was drafted to the U.S. Army, and then he received there, after his services, the American Campaign Medal, World War II Victory Medal, and the Army Occupation Medal. Prior to his military service, he married Amy Nakayama, and they raised 2 children together. And then also after that, he went to beauty school, and then they ended up together. He and Amy ran the beauty salon here in downtown Rocky Ford. Apparently, in what was the building first you mentioned?
And originally it was in the El Capitan Hotel, what they called the Blue Room. And then 1945, and then they moved it to the Grand Theater, the little salon there. They had the business for 71 years. So other than, it was in the Grand Theater building for 65 years, and it's the oldest, other than Harricata Farms, the longest Japanese-owned business in Otero County.
So one of the, just again to sort of sum up, I think the idea of adversity, loss and resilience is the idea that, Henry and his family, they wanted to be known as living their life as an American, and I thought that was pretty profound in a lot of our research too. This is sort of an interesting and surprising, but not also hopefully story that came out from the advisors in the Japanese American community here, but the story that they wanted to tell for Henry B. Mendenhall Sr. So not Japanese American himself, but was important to the community over the years. He was a banker here in Rocky Ford. He started out as a cashier, and then later throughout his career he worked there for 50 years and ended up being the president of the Rocky Ford National Bank. He was born in Nebraska, and he married a woman named Charlene Cover, who was the daughter of a well-known local family. They had 2 sons. Like I said, he rose through the ranks. Well, one of his sons, actually he was so adamant that his family sort of become accepting and wanted to be show friendship, and what's the word I'm looking for? I guess it's not really camaraderie, but I think that might be sort of the word I'm coming up with the Japanese, is that one of his sons he sent to a Japanese American summer school, and apparently the community also, so that he was the only banker that initially was willing to lend the money and shared a lot of financial and other types of business advice. thought that this was quite the story to include. Unfortunately, even though there was sort of kind of limited memory of racism from the Japanese Americans, there was a story where a cross was burned on their back lawn because of that. But other than that, they felt that it was important to mention how he was accepting of them. And I think that was quite profound, right? 3 generations of Japanese Americans wanted to honor him in his history. It's hard to find a whole lot of other information about him, to be honest. And we didn't actually contact any direct descendants besides a daughter in Littleton who did not respond to us.
Right. There was a number of deaths in the family right as we were doing this, and was just being able to catch people who already passed away, and Dave passed away, and all during this part, and so we were trying to reach out. We were not able to find all the family history that we would like to have included, but we can always add to it if we have access to more information later.
And you probably may know this or not, Mr. Mendenhall is buried at Block 8A. Our final untold story, the 5th one, is of Gaman and patience to endure, persevere, and this is represented by the Takeda brothers. So Bill Takeda was a great resource for us too.
And sister.
And Sumi. And so thank you again. And please, you can add anything here. So both of these they came here as brothers, and on their immigration cards there, January 18 is the date that is listed as their birth dates. But I'm actually, we're discussing, we're not really sure why January 15th, but maybe we would be able to speak to that. But essentially, it was apparently in the registry that parents in Japan were required to register their children. And so that was what was on their immigration cards when they came to this country. So from Japan, they were Issei. They were also from the Wakama Prefecture, and their family ran a plum farm. But because neither of them was the eldest son in their family, neither of them would inherit their family farms. And so for them, I think it was either decided by their family or not, but they were sent to the United States here, both of them as small children, aged 14 and 8, to live with their sister Tammy Takeda, who was married to Sadakichi Harada. So there's a lot of connection, of course, in the community at that time. Again, sent on the steamship, and they ended up arriving in Seattle. They had no food, no money at that time. They had already eaten it and spent it all, and thankfully to a kindly gentleman, he provided them money and some food and sent them to Rocky Ford here where their aunt was living. Their sister, sorry. So let's see. Well, okay, and as we've already talked about Sadakichi Harada and the farm that he had already established, these two brothers really ended up becoming also exceptional farmers by helping their family on the farm. And they raised cantaloupes, cucumbers, cabbage, and then in the early 1920s, of course, all of this hard work really helped, I think, add to the success of the Harada farms and then the Sunset brand. So this idea of Gaman and this patience to endure, the fact that they had to come here, and sort of persevere through the hard work and times. They also were self-taught. They taught themselves to read and write, do mathematics, and then their upbringing sort of passed on to their children. They ended up, Kisuyuki, am I saying that right? His name? Kichisuyuki.
Your uncle.
Kichi.
How do you pronounce his name? Your uncle Kichi. Kichi.
He did not marry, but Otero married Tomiko Momoi. Sorry, yes. And they had 7 children, and unfortunately 2 had passed. So, but they ended up spending as a couple most of the rest of their life running the Morrison farm. And we have a statement here that Otero never wanted Tomiko to work in the fields, but she always had a large garden, and their sons grew up working on the farm before leaving to college and establish their own lives. But that Mr. Morrison described Otero as one of the best farmers in Otero County. At the end of his life, Otero requested that he be cremated upon his death, so there's not an actual headstone in the cemetery for him. But his ashes rather were spread on the farm where he raised his family and built his reputation as a successful farmer and businessman. Later in life, he was very proud to get a citizenship following the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952, and waved his flag, so now I can vote. And then also we found it interesting or worthy of note that neither of them really shared what it felt like to leave Japan. I think Otero visited Japan a few times and came back, but really did not speak much about his experiences or the trauma of that early departure. So I think that's it for those stories. And I think one of the big lessons learned in this project, especially regarding the untold stories, was just how important the advisors were in providing the first-hand documentation and the direct sources of information, and just their willingness to share their information and stories guided by their oral histories. We couldn't do that without them. And as Rebecca pointed to earlier, this whole project is really for the community. So it's really important, I think, that we did it with them. So the selection of the untold stories and the subjects of them came from them, and hopefully demonstrated well enough the Japanese American intangible heritage and the values of them. And that kind of came through with Mr. Mendenhall too, just sort of how they appreciated his acceptance and friendship. And then and I think I've already mentioned doing it with them instead of for them in these types of projects is significant. Do you want to talk about it? Sure. Yeah.
Okay, so I think, I still, and as we did the research and worked with Sumi and everybody to talk about the family members, having grown here, I knew them. And I called Jane, I'm just almost in tears, because I'm thinking about this 14-year-old boys that were put in a ship by themselves to come here, and how strong they were. And they never talked about how traumatic that had to have been. Come on, perseverance. I'm incredibly grateful to the families for sharing the stories with us and allowing us to tell them. I think it's true, that's what she had to write now. But so what's next? These untold stories, we've written them. This is a really amazing way of kind of taking a cemetery and bringing it to life, because it is. It's about life. It's about people. So these will be copies of all this will go to the museums, to the library. They'll be archived. When Kathy and I went to the National Registry Review Board meeting, and there was a group of, they said, well, they gotten letters. There's a group called the Asian Pacific Islanders Americans in Historic Preservation. It's a national group. They're based out of Seattle. They had heard about the nomination, what we were doing, and they sent letters of support for it. So I've been in communications with their director. Their conference starts today. They do one every 2 years. And I said, this would be a great story, but we just didn't have the time to do it, but maybe later. But we will share those with them too, because there's a lot of people trying to find family, work through those. Otero County, we also have a CLG grant that we're developing a consumable workbook that will go to every third grade student in Otero County. We can print them for 3 years. There'll be a teacher's resource manual that will go with them. Tammy Ridenauer, our chair, our former teacher, educator, curriculum developer. Ashley here is also on our board, but the board's all working on that, and it's a way to tell Otero County history through our historic places. But so the cemetery is one of the sites that we will be using. Those untold stories will go into the teacher's resource manual. We're hoping that's something that kids can start thinking about, so many of us have stories. If you start thinking about it, putting it in context, and maybe make people start understanding the cemetery and the history. It's not just headstones. They're people and their stories, and this community was built by those people. And then API-HIP, they have they're trying to map around the country. It's what they call a history PIM project of important Japanese or Asian Pacific Islander sites around the country so that people can visit them. Something like it's been done with the African American sites. They're starting to do that around the site. So we will pin this and put it into that database so that people that want to learn more or want to visit can come and do that. Oop, go too far. So so why does this matter? Well, Valley View Hilcrest Cemetery, it's on the National Registry now. It's been recognized. It is now eligible. They can apply for state historical fund grants. There's some national programs. There's things we can do there. There's some restoration that maybe needs to be done on the stone wall, built in 1916, and some of it was the original entrance to Valley View. Grants can be applied for that, can be done. Restoration of the headstones. I'm going to show you a slide here in a minute. If you know the history of the cemetery, it used to be flood irrigated. They had canal water. So a lot of the headstones are really leaning. When they go, they're going to break. We're going to lose them. And some of them are so valuable. The water, it's well water, that starts eating some of the stones. There's cleaning. So I've actually had conversations with the State Historical Fund. If there's interest, there's a possibility we can get a grant. And we would do as an education project of kind of how to do headstone and cemetery restoration. Bring in experts that can help teach us how to do that. We can reset some of those stones and make sure that we don't lose it. And not just the Japanese, but we can use the Japanese section to start that. And we can also recognize other sites associated with the Japanese American history. I'm embarrassed. When we did the first project, I'm so embarrassed. My grandmother lived right behind the Grand Theater and across the street from Sandy's parents. And I didn't kind of think about, oh yeah, they had the beauty salon there for all those years. Well, the Grand Theater, that space is, the Grand Theater, including that space, is on the state register. The nomination was done many years ago. Darrell Schultz, who was the city manager at that time, who was an engineer, civil engineer, he wrote it. He did a good job for an engineer, but he wasn't a historian. But we can do something with that, and speaking with History Colorado, we will do an amendment to that nomination to recognize the Japanese history and the importance of that business that was there for 65 years. And so then that all, and they've got some plans maybe for the Grand Theater. They're going to be applying for some grants to put those restrooms and those things into that part of what they always wanted to do. I would love to see if there's interest in the community to develop more of these stories. There are so many amazing people at the cemetery to kind of tell all those people that have done so much, people that have served in the military, people that have just know so many things. So we can develop more health stories. I would love to see it. We have, Otero County has something like 37 cemeteries. There's a lot of them, a lot of small ones. But there are remarkable people buried everywhere. The Manzanova Cemetery, Lenore Rucker, who helped bring all the settlers to the African American settlement. There's a number of them are buried there. Those are stories. So the untold stories, we have to develop the parameters and the research, the documentation parameters based upon what Jane did. But we can do more of those. There's additional research and fundraising that can be done because of this. And all this information, all the ones that we've documented, can go onto the Find a Grave so that families can know where they can come visit family members if they want to, or do research, or do those types of things. So now when it comes to how can the community and everybody support it? Research, keep documentation. If you have research, save it, make sure it goes someplace, archive it, source materials. Everybody should have a vested interest in our history and the care and the maintenance of the cemetery. It's a remarkable place. It's been recognized nationally. 2 sets of my great-grandparents are buried there. My sister's here. Got several family, Tammy's a family member. 2 sets of great-grandparents are buried there. 2 sets of grandparents are buried. My parents are buried there. Our uncles are, I have a vested interest in there, that cemetery. We should all care about it because it really does tell the full history of Rocky Ford. resources, and maybe we can do some grants and fundraising. So there's a lot of things that can come out of this. And, you know, I hope this helps to develop community engagement. There's work we can do. This opens the door for doing it. You know, we've had the headstone that Kathy mentioned, the little 2-year-old child, that when we started was standing up, it's now laying there. It's broken off. There's headstones that are going to fall. These are some of the ones that are in what was the Potters Park. There's some very old Hispanic and other ones that are just disintegrating because in some cases they weren't made of the strongest materials. But the fence, there's a lot that can be done. And so I'm hoping that the community is engaged and comes supports the city, supports the staff out there. It's amazing what they do with a small staff. And so, you know, there's opportunities for us all to be part of making sure that this really a remarkable place and all these stories continue. And so now, a project like this, I remember asking early on when we were doing the estimate for the grants, like, how many hours is this going to take? And I went, oh my God. And so, first of all, I know on my behalf, and we all 3 have spouses. Thank you for putting up with, for mine, thank you for putting up with me, Keith. I'm sitting in the motorhome in Palm Springs researching and getting a hold of the Otero Valley Historical Society to find stuff and writing stuff, and he's up here, I was at a meeting, he's up here setting up chairs and stuff for me, so thank you, and then your spouses are also, okay, phew, that was over. Then you go to the next one. But State Historical Fund, these projects we cannot do without the State Historical Fund. That fund was established by the voters of Colorado when they established limited state gambling, and they said we want a certain percentage of the taxes the casinos pay to go to historic preservation. So we are incredibly lucky. Very few states have a fund like we do. So we thank those. The county commissioners and Amy White-Tanabe, the county administrator, they allow us to apply for these grants. We work with Amy to do all there's regular grant reporting and deliverables and financial statements and all those things. And so they do that. The Rocky Ford Library, thank you for having those CDs and for having all of Helen's West stuff and sharing it with us. Lex Nichols, for doing the ortho mosaic, the county, he has a drone, a very high quality drone. He's licensed at the very highest level. Not only did he drone map the cemetery once, he did it twice. He wanted to do it once when there was no leaves on the trees, so you can really see it and you can zoom down, you can actually read headstones. And then he went back and did it after everything was green and come out. And so that was all that, the drone mapping, his time was all donated. The grant we just had to pay to, he uploads everything and has those orthomosaics mapped. And so that was all that we had to pay for. Darren Garcia, who works for the county, he's on the preservation board. He was amazing for helping us track down history. One of my classmates, Danny Chaparro, I mean, I was on the phone to him constantly. And he helped me find a lot of information. Tom Valencia, the sexton out at the cemetery, was a lot of help from Rebecca, the city clerk's office. It's like, pull things, and I called him, I think it was after the State National Review Board meeting in Denver, and they said, about how many graves are there in the cemetery? I don't know, and I'm not gonna go count them all. And we had, I think we had a week or 10 days to, it was a really tight turnaround. So I got a hold of Rebecca and she got a hold of Tom, and they went through and they figured out approximately, we know how many graves were out there. We also know there's over 250 in the Japanese section, and we have a pretty good idea of how many military, thanks to Bill Takeda, because he puts flags on them. You know, the veterans do it every time. Donna Haricata helped a great deal. Jonathan Thumas, a PhD, our translator, was amazing. We could never do that otherwise. And of course, Helen West, who did it. And then to our all wonderful advisors. So a project like this takes a lot of people, it takes a lot of help to track stuff down. So to all those people, thank you very much. And thank you for coming and for supporting this project. And I know for me it was an honor to work on it. So thank you. Because it's like I told him, I said, I got this project, I need your help. you all for coming, and if you have any questions,
I
yeah.
have a question. Are there a lot of cemeteries on the National Historic Registry? You don't hear about that often.
You don't hear as many cemeteries because, I mean, every place has a cemetery, and cemeteries are not listed just because of the people. There has to be something, a bigger historic theme generally. So the really unique two different designs here from a landscape standpoint is really important. And then how much you can say, if you want to know the history of the Japanese in Otero County, go out and walk those headstones. Read the translations, and because of that. So it is unusual. There's some, Rosemont and Pueblo is on the register, Fairmont and Denver. You know, there's a few, but not that many.